preserving and interpreting the colonial history of the Virginia frontier. George Mercer Company, the garrison of Fort Loudoun, is ready for a patrol. The massive Fort Loudoun overlooked downtown Winchester, Virginia. England and France, with allied countries, engaged in a series of wars lasting around 100 years. 7 of those years, 1756 to 1763, were called the 7 Years' War. The conflict had land and sea battles around the world, according to Mr. French. In North America, the 7 Years' War was referred to as the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War in North America was a struggle between France and England for the control of North America and its fur trade. Both England and France used Indian tribes as allies in this conflict. France based its claims on the 1669 exploration of the Ohio River by Robert La Salle. In 1749, Céloron de Blainville buried a series of lead plates along the Ohio River, reinforcing the French claim to the area. Otters were found along the rivers and lakes by the fur trappers. Great Britain based its claims on land drained by the Ohio River on the 1671 Batson-Fallam expedition. Kercheval stated that there were several instances of the Indians committing murders on the whites about the Potomac and South Branch several years before Braddock's defeat. He goes on to write that about the year 1752, James Davis was killed up the Potomac, and in the succeeding year, William Zane and several of his family were taken prisoners on the South Branch. The French and Indian War in North America actually lasted 9 years, from 1754 through 1763. The Nemacolin Path brought the French and British into direct contact in the Ohio Valley. Christopher Gist, an agent of the Ohio Land Company, signed the Treaty of Logstown with the Delaware and Shawnee, giving Virginia control of the Ohio Valley. George Washington spent some of his youth surveying land on the western frontier of Virginia. In 1753, Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent a diplomatic mission to Fort Loudoun near Lake Erie. The mission, led by George Washington, was charged with asking the French to leave the Ohio Valley. Doman states a young George Washington in the red coat representing Virginia and the British government meets with the French commander at Fort Loudoun to request that they leave the area. The French refusal to leave the region led to the Jumonville incident in the French and Indian War. As the group traveled by raft down the Allegheny River, the waters became rough and Gist and Washington fell overboard. The two spent the night on an island with their clothes frozen to their bodies. Indians did not see land as private property, and boundaries were not strictly defined. The British tried to avoid difficulty by negotiating treaties with the Indians. Indians saw agreements as changeable. Europeans saw treaties as binding. The French advantages included a larger land claim, an already existing system of forts in the Ohio Valley, a majority of the Indian tribes as allies, and superior military officers and army. The British advantages included a larger population, powerful Iroquois allies, control of the oceans, a population concentrated in a relatively small area, and a desire to protect their own property. Many natives didn't feel that the French were as much of a threat due to the French focus on the fur trade rather than colonization. Governor Dinwiddie ordered Captain William Trent to return to the confluence of the Ohio River to build a fort. In May 1753, Dinwiddie ordered Washington to return to the fort at Trent's backup. Before he reached the site, Washington learned that the French had defeated Trent. They had destroyed the partially built British fort and constructed one of their own, which they named Fort Duquesne. Commanding a British force, Washington returned and defeated a French detachment in a skirmish at Jumonville Glen in western Pennsylvania during the spring of 1754. Washington's troops killed 10 Frenchmen, including their leader, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The war between the French and the British had begun. Washington ordered the rapid completion of the Great Meadows Fort. Fort Necessity was the name he gave the small, quickly built fort. On July 3, 1754, 1,600 French soldiers and Indians attacked the British fort. After a rainy, day-long battle, Washington surrendered his forces. Washington was required to leave the Ohio Valley and not return to the area to build forts for a year. A map of the North Central American colonies during the war. The next summer in 1755, General Braddock led a British army to the forks of the Ohio, now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to capture the French Fort Duquesne. Braddock had companies of Colonel Washington's Virginia provincial troops, some with blue and red regimental jackets, but others still in civilian clothes. Virginia regiment uniforms changed from the all-red of 1754 to the blue and red worn from 1756 to 1762. Native warriors reported the advancing British to the French at Fort Duquesne. Part of Braddock's army passed through the eastern panhandle, camping at Evans Fort, then on to Fort Loudoun and Winchester, crossed Hampshire County up to Okonoco, where they forded the Potomac at Fort Cox en route to Fort Cumberland. On July 9, 1755, nearing their target, Braddock's column was surprised by a large force of French and Indians coming out of the fort. In savage fighting, the Indians fired from behind trees while the British stayed in lines along the open road. Washington, serving as an aide to General Braddock, showed leadership during the battle and in helping the mortally wounded Braddock. The British forces were hit from 3 sides. After the battle, Washington led the retreating British forces back to Fort Cumberland on Wills Creek in Cumberland, Maryland, and on to Virginia. Fort Cumberland was on a hill overlooking the Potomac River. A few days later, while still in Pennsylvania, Braddock died. To hide his body from Indians, Washington had him buried in the road and the retreating army to march over the grave. Kevin O'Malley sketched the burial. Fearing attacks on the frontier after the defeat, Virginia's Governor Dinwiddie raised the funds for Washington to build Fort Loudoun. A Cherokee warrior allied to the British watches the surveyors at the Fort Loudoun site. Virginia Regiment soldiers under Washington worked hard clearing the land and cutting large trees to build Fort Loudoun. Colonel George Washington, who designed it, writes to Lieutenant Colonel Adam Stephen that the construction has started on Fort Loudoun, Winchester, Virginia, on May 18, 1756, states Jim Moyer. Moving the mass of logs needed to build the fort walls required brute force and teamwork. Virginia Regiment soldiers cut and shaped the fort's timbers and filled the wide space between the inner and outer walls with rocks and packed soil. Caption says, Fort Loudoun in 1756, George Washington supervised the construction of Fort Loudoun in Winchester as a defense. The construction of the large wood fort, including the interior buildings, took a couple of years to complete. Captain George Mercer, Fort Loudoun commander, addresses the company. One of the Fort Loudoun's four corner bastions, which had cannon on them. The fort contained several large buildings, including barracks. Cannon crews manned posts on the bastions. Alert Virginia Regiment sentries guarded the forts and camps. The massive double timber walls, reinforced with yards of stone and dirt fill, provided a tough defense against any attacks. Four-wheeled wagons and two-wheel carts were used to transport supplies to the Virginia Regiment in Fort Loudoun. The land around the fort was cleared of brush to deny cover to an approaching enemy. The cannon on the Fort Loudoun bastions were powerful weapons defending Winchester area families. Washington brought his own blacksmith to help with the fort's needs. A view of the hills to the west of Fort Loudoun from the top of a bastion. The fort became a staging point for supplies headed to outlying frontier forts. Fort Loudoun was similar to this one completed. A trench was an issue due to the limestone rock. Two years were spent digging and blasting the fort's well through that solid rock. George Washington designed the plans for Fort Loudoun, Virginia. Native Americans, brave and proud of their cultures, resisted the taking of their lands. French troops outside a settler's cabin on the disputed frontier. Harvesting crops on isolated farms was risky when the conflict flared up. A Virginia regiment column advances alertly en route to a frontier post. The western Virginia frontier was sparsely populated. French units conducted drills like the British and provincial troops. Wagons transported loads of supplies to Fort Loudoun from coastal cities. Shawnee and Delaware raiding parties traveling from the Ohio River area villages struck Virginia frontier settlements. Rangers were deployed along the frontier in all types of weather to scout in support of the Mercer Company. Indian war parties could strike quickly. French troops often fought alongside their Indian allies when attacking British forces or frontier outposts. Treating the Indians respectfully helped gain their cooperation with French units. A Virginia regiment company drives the enemy from a farm field. The loss of lives in the conflict was tragic. It could be dangerous for settlers to venture out to tend their herds. A French combatant is taken prisoner by Mercer Company soldiers. Mingo, Shawnee, and Delaware warriors were wary of the English settlers moving into their traditional hunting grounds in western Virginia. The natives were at home in the woods. City-recruited soldiers could be uneasy on wilderness patrols. Children taken captive during raids were often adopted into the tribe, but the fate of adults was often grim. This painting of George Washington shows him wearing his Virginia regimental coat. The western Virginia mountains posed an obstacle to the travel of armies. Cherokee warriors often fought on the side of the British and Virginia provincials. A soldier fires a small mortar during a field deployment. French troops discussed plans of advance with an Indian ally at a camp. Local militia scouts were dispatched from frontier forts as a warning system against Indian attacks. Shawnee and Delaware raiding parties blended in with nature till it was too late for unsuspecting settlers. Misty mountain valleys hid perils to isolated settlers and small military units. This Eric Cherry sketch depicts Fort Loudoun sitting on the hill. A Mercer Company detachment of the Virginia Regiment training in the countryside. Fort Loudoun hosted delegations of Cherokee and Catawba Indians allied to the British, local militia units, and British Army detachments. Pennsylvania provisional troops were involved regionally in the conflict. Tuscarora and Nottoway groups also made the long journey north to Fort Loudoun, Virginia. French soldiers take cover during a skirmish with British forces. Virginia provisional soldiers learned to fight from the cover of trees when possible, like the natives. Patrols were sent into the forest to look for signs of French and Indian activities. A joke is shared in the ranks. Caught in the open, these settlers were overwhelmed. A Pennsylvania regiment officer addresses his troops as the minister stands by to provide spiritual guidance. Women were often taken captive and at times adopted or married into the tribe. French Marines engaged British troops in a heavily wooded area. Fort Loudoun itself was never attacked. A native warrior allied to the French consults with a tribal matron. In Mecklenburg, Fort Shepherd was a stone house where neighbors gathered at times of an onslaught. It is said that one of Thomas Shepherd's sons was born here in the fort while the fort was being besieged by a band of the bloody marauders. Height Fort was built near Mecklenburg, now Shepherdstown, during the French and Indian War, according to Bettinger. Governor Dinwiddie sent Major Andrew Lewis with a company of militia to confront the Shawnee beyond the Ohio River. Lewis disbanded his forces at Devon in Mingo County after losing much of their supplies and arms due to the overturned canoes before reaching the Shawnee towns. Crossing North Mountain at Mills Gap in 1756 after the defeat of General Braddock's forces, a raiding party killed members of the Kelly family near Jaredstown before attacking the Evans and Strodes family near Evans Fort at the south end of present-day Martinsburg State at Aylar. War touched that section of Frederick County which would become Berkeley County. John Evans built a stockade fort which bore his name. General Edward Braddock's troops encamped at Big Spring in 1755 and again in 1759, although Fort Evans is not mentioned in any documents associated with Braddock's stay. It is known, however, that Evans did erect a fort here and that it was subjected to attack by Native Americans in 1756. Aylar said, "I spoke of the massacre of Neely Fort on the Opequon Creek in the county of Berkeley. It was about daylight on the 17th of September, 1756, that a roving band of Indians surprised that little fort and murdered and scalped all they found in it." In 1758, near Hedges Fort at the current town of Hedgesville, a man was killed while watching the spring at Bath. He was believed to be up to no good. A few rascals had been dressing up as Indians to scare people away, then plunder their homes. Warriors watched Edwards Fort at Capon Bridge before luring out and ambushing a small unit of Captain Mercer's company stationed there. A log palisade wall connecting the Edwards house and the farm buildings provided some protection against Indian attacks. Virginia regiment units were often based at frontier forts like Edwards, Ashby, Pearsall, and Pleasant. This is a Fort Edwards archaeological drawing. A detachment of Mercer's company prepares to patrol from Fort Edwards, which is under construction. A court-martial after the Battle of Great Capon, sketched by Eric Cherry. Surviving women and children were often in shock after their capture. Volley fire from the Brown Bess muskets was devastating to attackers. Often the small engagements were in the dense woods and thick brush. Units like Rutherford's Rangers scouted the frontier in search of raiding parties. Provincial troops' clothing wore out and the supply chain was erratic, resulting in some variation. Movement has drawn the attention of provincial soldiers of the Mercer Company. Young captives were often adopted into the tribe. Combat was hand-to-hand and brutal at times. Hinkle's fort was located in Pendleton County. Warriors would often take scalps as grisly trophies. Fort Van Meter is along the south branch of the Potomac River between Moorfield and Romney, West Virginia. Sergeant Culver guards Fort Van Meter while on a patrol near the trough. Captives were often forced to walk back to villages in the Ohio River area. Captain Mercer parleys with the leader of a small milice and Indian group. A Mercer's company squad advances to push back a few warriors. A French milice observes the movement of a British column. Volley fire. French heavy siege mortars dug into earthworks. French-Canadian milice or militiamen often supported the Indians on raids along the frontier. American natives were a proud and noble people. A Virginia provincial soldier guards a settler's cabin as officers meet inside. The ensign carried the company flag and the drummer signaled the troops. Skillfully hidden native raiders wait in ambush. Virginia provincial soldiers engage hostile natives. The drummer and messenger relayed commands to the unit while the rangers scouted ahead. Combat became hand-to-hand at times. Captives were forced to endure a grueling trek to the Ohio country. Weakness was not accepted. Virginia Regiment Provincials march across the clearing. Native Americans discussing the future of their tribe in the path of the encroaching Europeans. Fort Harrison in Dayton, Virginia, near Harrisonburg. British provincial troops fire from cover at French and Indian column. During times of peace, trade between the natives and Europeans was often mutually beneficial. French-Canadian militia or milice, as they were known, were a valuable part of the French military forces. Randy Crane and the fort supporters bring history alive at Fort Ashby. This is a sketch of the archaeological work done at Fort Ashby. According to Cook, Capon was a stockade located at the forks of Capon in the Great Capon River Valley, Hampshire County, and Cook was a stockade located on Patterson's Creek, 6 miles southeast of Kaiser and 9 miles from Fort Ashby. Mercer Company troops reload their Brown Bess muskets while under fire. Chiefs ponder the path that their tribe should travel with the arrival of settlers. Valentine Powers and his brother, with a couple others, left Fort George near Petersburg to visit their farms. They were attacked by Indians, resulting in his capture and the death of his brother, according to causual. The effect of getting hit with a musket ball was staggering. White's Fort was a palisaded house built by Major Robert White near the Capon River. Williams, also a stockade, was situated on the south branch of the Potomac, 2 miles below Hanging Rock, Hampshire County, stated Cook. The following two forts along the south branch of the Potomac River in modern Pendleton County, West Virginia, were captured and destroyed within a few days of each other by Indians. The captives were separated. One group of 17 was killed and the others taken as hostages. The Fort Sybert victims rest here. On Lost River, there were two forts, one called Riddle's Fort and the other called Warden's Fort, where William Warden and a Mr. Taft were killed and the fort burnt down, according to causual. A Kevin O'Malley sketch of Fort Loudoun. There were other forts along the Virginia frontier. This small stone fort is located right on Route 11 in Strasburg, Virginia. The Iroquois living in New York had villages of bark-covered longhouses. Male captives, as a test of bravery, often had to run a gauntlet between two lines of Indians who struck them with clubs. Fort William Henry in New York was captured by the French in 1757 and destroyed. The British troops had built fortifications along Loyalhanna Creek. Fort Ligonier's cannon fire helped drive off the attackers. Troops manned the fort's sturdy log walls to repulse the attack. Here are the campaign routes against French-held Fort Duquesne at present-day Pittsburgh. Red is Braddock's 1755 route. Green is Forbes' 1758 route. A British unit drills before resuming the march to the Forks. In 1758, with a large British army under General Forbes marching towards Fort Duquesne, the French, fearing they would lose in battle, blew up their fort and retreated north. The British immediately rebuilt the fort, naming it Fort Pitt. This victory gave Great Britain control of the Ohio Valley. Forbes' troops located some of the remains of Braddock's fallen men. Fort Niagara, a major French fort on Lake Ontario, was captured by the British in July of 1759 after a siege. Wagon tracks of the Europeans run through an abandoned native village. Rogers Rangers were colonial riflemen trained to fight and survive in the forest. French General Montcalm and British General Wolfe were killed in a large battle at Quebec. A year later, the French lost Montreal to the British. In Europe, the fighting lasted 3 years more. Louis Stevens was a Frederick County militia officer reporting to George Washington. Local tradition maintains that Louis built a stone powder magazine near his house and mill on Cedar Creek, according to Beginnings website. This powder magazine, which still stands today, was later used by Isaac Zane when he produced artillery munitions for the Rev War and later as an ice house. This site was known as Stevens Fort and most likely was encircled by a log stockade during the French and Indian War. Another source doubts its use as a fort, according to the Beginnings website. The 1763 Treaty of Paris officially ended the French and Indian War. In 1764, after the end of the French and Indian War, a group of 18 Delaware Indians crossed the mountains, passing near Foreman's Fort. This fort was located near Hanging Rocks above Romney, according to Causual. Two male settlers that were out hunting were spotted and killed. The raiding party then moved into Frederick County, splitting into two parties. One group of 8 went to the Cedar Creek settlement. The other group attacked people in the area where Dr. White had erected a stockade on his land. The people in the area were on their way to the fort when they were attacked by these 10 Indians. Several settlers were killed or wounded, according to Causual. This attack on the Clousers in Shawnee Land and other white settlers along Great North Mountain reached just outside of Fry's Fort on Cedar Creek. Hostages were taken all the way to Ohio, according to Moyer. A year later, Colonel Bouquet retrieves them. He documents their names, ages, and descriptions in his ledger. The hostages taken were near their ancestral land located near the water wheel at the entrance of Shawnee Land. Fort Loudoun was used by the militia during Pontiac's War of 1763 to 1766 and during Dunsmore's War of 1774. After the threats of Indian attacks ceased, the fort began to deteriorate and fall into ruins. After the conflicts, it saw little use. Locals started tearing parts of the fort down. In a few years, only the fort's well and the tall mounds of earth and rock remained. The government in London imposed taxes on the colonies to pay for the war. The colonists particularly disliked one tax, the Stamp Act. In a fiery speech before the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry proclaimed, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," according to author Vicki Wood. This disagreement over taxes helped lay the groundwork for the American Revolution. However, like Fort Williams, a short distance down the river, Washington was acquainted with Fort Foreman because he passed by it several times during the course of his years on the frontier, and he undoubtedly knew the Foreman family. This defense was probably a blockhouse and a stockade, its dimensions not being known. The Continental Army grew into a tough fighting force. The capture of the British troops at Trenton, Saratoga, and Yorktown saw thousands of British soldiers become prisoners of war. The Continental Army turned many of the British POWs over to militia who guarded them on the way to and while at Fort Loudoun. A stockade fort was erected on the French and Indian War era Fort Loudoun site and a few nearby areas to house many of the prisoners. This model of Fort Loudoun during the Revolutionary War was at the George Washington Office Museum for years. Our sign on North Loudoun Street, Winchester, Virginia, marks the Fort Loudoun site. Our mission is to preserve and interpret the colonial history of the Virginia frontier. Mercer Company, garrison of Fort Loudoun, June 15, 2019. Ladies of the company also participated. A cannon used for Fort Loudoun's defense sits at the George Washington's Office Museum in Winchester. Here we combine the fort outline with an aerial photo. Cannonballs, musket balls, and other artifacts have been excavated from the site. Here's a George Washington's Well postcard. This Fort Loudoun and Winchester diorama is at the George Washington's Headquarters Museum in Winchester. The archaeological digs at Fort Loudoun, the remains of a bayonet found on the site, a Washington's Office postcard, this overlay view of Fort Loudoun with red walls and a green trench. Chris Will, an Eagle Scout, outlined the walls of the Northwest Bastion. Postcard showing the earthen remains of a fort bastion. Mercer Company founding family, Captain Tony Elar Jr., son Tony Elar III, and wife Kathleen. Ensign Eric Bartok, Becky Wilson Bartok, and their son Brendan. Sloan Culver, wife Patricia, and daughter Charlotte. Here we have Phil Hunter, Bob Flanagan, and Melanie Lewis helping with the French and Indian War Foundation event. Mercer Company at George Washington's headquarters, President's Day, February 2019. French and Indian War historian, author, and fort supporter Norman Baker gives a presentation at Fort Loudoun Day 2015. The Colonel James Wood II chapter of the SAR Color Guard held a flag raising at Fort Loudoun Day 2013. Linda Ross and William Hunt at Fort Loudoun Day 2014. Linda served on the French and Indian War Foundation Board of Directors for years. A George Mercer Company detachment and fort supporters at Fort Loudoun Day 2018. Jacob Dean and Andrew Kilcup flank Jeff Dean, who portrays a French milice. Mercer Company marching from the fort to Washington's headquarters in 2019. Tom and Amy Knipen's son, French supporters of the French and Indian War Foundation. Jeff Pennington and Rocky Shores of Rutherford's Rangers and Jacob Dean are all living historians working with Mercer Company. Artist and Fort Loudoun supporter Kevin O'Malley and historian Jim Moyer at the Wayside Theater, Middletown, Virginia, December of 2017. Native matron Debbie Turtle Swartz educates the public at a George Mercer Company Abrams Delight event. Captain Johnny Smith and Lieutenant Val Shoup portray French Royal Artillery Unit of Fort Loudoun Day 2017. Native warrior Andrew Kilcup brings history alive at local events. Friend and Foe with David Pancake, a Fort Edwards historian on the right. White's Fort and the Clouser House talk at Shawnee Land by Jim Moyer. Eric Bartok, Captain Tony Elar Jr., and Claude Everhart as Dr. Craig at Fry's Fort. Quentin and Gavin Culver, along with Jim Moyer, arrive at Fort Ashby Days. Dave Pancake, a living historian, educates the crowd about Fort Edwards. George Mercer Company at Fort Loudoun Day, May of 2019. The Mercer Company Christmas Dinner at the Wayside Theater, Middletown, Virginia, in December of 2017. In front are Sally Trevis, Patricia Wolf Culver, Kathleen Elar, and Phil Hunter. Washington's election event in Winchester, June of 2019. Sonia brightens up the GMC camp at Abrams Delight, September of 2019. Native warrior Jacob Dean shares his Cherokee culture. Abrams Delight encampment in the fall of 2019. Rangers enjoying some quiet time. French and Indian War historians at Fort Ashby 2019. George Mercer Company troops toasting the king.